On a desolate Arctic island, long after the pyramids rose, and Rome had yet to be born, a small group of mammoths clung to survival, isolated by rising seas and cut off from the world they lived on, giants from another age. But their story didn't end with a dramatic hunt or volcanic doom. It ended with something far stranger: their DNA. The very blueprint of life began to unravel. Mutations accumulated, vital genes broke down, smell, fertility, immunity. Even their coats began to change, piece by piece. Their biology betrayed them until the last of them stood alone in the wind, not because the world had killed them, but because their own code had collapsed. This is the haunting story of the last mammoths, not just how they died, but how their DNA doomed them from within. Chapter 1. The Mammoths That Outlived Time. During the Ice Age, mammoths were among the most successful and iconic megafauna to ever walk the earth, thriving in the harshest and coldest environments known to prehistoric life. These enormous creatures, covered in dense woolly fur and insulated by thick layers of fat, were evolution's answer to the unforgiving climates of the Pleistocene epoch. With towering frames and spiraling tusks that could grow longer than a man is tall, mammoths roamed across the vast open steppe tundra that once stretched from the western coasts of Europe across Asia to the frozen plains of North America. For over 5 million years, they evolved and adapted to shifting environments, giving rise to several species. These included the colossal imperial mammoths of North America, standing over 4 meters tall, and the smaller, more cold-adapted woolly mammoths of Eurasia, perfectly suited for icy winds and sub-zero temperatures. Mammoths were not only physically powerful, but also socially and cognitively advanced. They lived in matriarchal herds, led by experienced females who guided the group across hundreds of miles of seasonal migration routes remembered from generations past. Their strong family bonds allowed them to raise calves, protect the vulnerable, and likely grieve for the lost. Behaviors that show deep emotional and social intelligence. They coexisted with other Ice Age giants like woolly rhinos, giant ground sloths, cave bears, and the fearsome saber-toothed cats, often competing for space and resources but managing to survive through cooperation, memory, and resilience. Despite the constant threats from predators and extreme weather, mammoths were highly adaptable grazers, feeding on a variety of grasses, shrubs, and herbs that covered the glacial plains. Their success as a species made them a keystone presence in the Ice Age ecosystem. However, as the last glacial period came to an end about 12,000 years ago, global temperatures began to rise rapidly. The glaciers retreated, and with them, the vast mammoth steppe started to disappear. Forests and wetlands replaced the open grasslands that had supported these giants for millennia. Simultaneously, a new and far more unpredictable threat emerged: modern humans, Homo sapiens, who were now expanding into the mammoths' territory. Armed with advanced tools, cooperative hunting strategies, and a growing population, early humans began to hunt mammoths not just for meat, but for bones and tusks used in shelters, tools, and art. The pressures of climate change and increasing human predation began to create ecological stress that mammoths could not withstand indefinitely. Gradually, their populations declined across Eurasia and North America, and by around 10,000 years ago, most mammoths had vanished from the mainland. Their extinction was not a sudden event, but a slow region-by-region retreat that took place over thousands of years. While some experts argue that climate change alone was responsible, and others believe human hunting tipped the balance, it is now widely accepted that a combination of both factors likely sealed their fate. Yet the story of the mammoth did not end there. Against all odds, small, isolated populations managed to survive in remote locations where the effects of climate change were less severe and human presence was minimal. One of the most fascinating of these refugees was Wrangel Island, a remote, wind-beaten land off the northeastern coast of Siberia. Cut off from the mainland by rising sea levels, this island became an accidental sanctuary for a group of woolly mammoths. Protected from predators and untouched by humans, these mammoths continued to live for thousands of years after their mainland relatives had gone extinct. Remarkably, they survived until around 4,000 years ago, meaning that when the pyramids of Egypt were being built, mammoths were still alive and walking the beaches of Wrangel Island. However, their isolation, while initially a source of safety, eventually became a source of vulnerability. With such a small and isolated population, genetic diversity declined drastically. Inbreeding became more common, leading to an accumulation of harmful mutations. Genetic studies have shown evidence of serious developmental problems in the final Wrangel Island mammoths, including weakened immune systems, reduced fertility, and possibly even changes to their behavior and sense of smell. Their extinction, unlike the dramatic die-offs seen elsewhere, was a quiet unraveling from within. No human spear ended their story, nor did a final ice storm. Rather, it was a slow biological collapse caused by the limits of long-term isolation. The last mammoths died out in silence, unknown to the world that had moved on without them. Today, their bones and frozen remains tell a haunting story, not only of a species that once ruled the Earth's coldest frontiers, but also of fragility, resilience, and the delicate balance between survival and extinction. Chapter 2: Genetic Bottleneck. How isolation breaks a species from within. During the final chapter of their existence, the woolly mammoths of Wrangel Island faced a threat unlike any they had encountered in their long evolutionary history, not from predators, not from humans, and not from the changing climate that had reshaped the world around them. At first, Wrangel Island appeared to be a sanctuary, a remote and undisturbed refuge where these last mammoths could live free from hunting, competition, or environmental catastrophe. There were no saber-toothed cats prowling its frozen plains, no wildfires burning its tundra, and no human tribes chasing them with spears. There was only wind, silence, and isolation. But that isolation, while it had protected them at first, was slowly becoming their greatest threat. The danger wasn't in the environment. It was inside them, hidden in their very biology. When a species becomes cut off from the rest of its kind, with a population reduced to only a few hundred or fewer, it passes through what scientists call a genetic bottleneck. This is a critical point where genetic diversity collapses. Evolution, which depends on variation and natural selection, begins to work differently when there are so few individuals. Every new birth carries more weight. Every mutation, whether neutral, harmful, or helpful, is passed on more easily because there are no longer enough individuals for natural selection to filter them out effectively. Without a large, genetically diverse population to buffer against these changes, damaging mutations begin to accumulate. Over time, these invisible flaws begin to chip away at the health and function of the species. Wrangel's mammoths were likely reduced to a population of fewer than 500 individuals, and possibly far fewer during some generations. Each time a calf was born, it carried the full legacy of an increasingly fragile gene pool. At first, the changes would have been almost unnoticeable. Small losses in fertility, subtle behavioral shifts. But as generations passed, the effects grew worse. Thousands of years later, when scientists studied the DNA of Wrangel Island mammoths and compared it to that of healthier, earlier mainland populations, the results were alarming. Vital genes had stopped working. Some mutations had damaged reproductive genes, particularly those related to male fertility. Others affected sensory perception, especially the genes responsible for smell, an essential sense for mammoths that depended on scent to find food, recognize kin, detect predators, and locate mates. Genes involved in immune system function had broken down, leaving the mammoths more vulnerable to disease. Mutations were also found in genes controlling urinary functions, skin health, and even fur development. Perhaps most haunting were the mutations linked to fur pigmentation. It's likely that some mammoths began developing discolored, patchy, or even translucent coats, not for camouflage, but as unintended side effects of genetic decay. These once majestic animals, with their rich brown fur and towering strength, may have begun to look like faded ghosts, pale, sickly reflections of the powerful creatures they once were. Even more tragically, some genes that played a role in social behavior, such as those that allowed individuals to recognize one another by scent, had deteriorated. For animals that lived in close-knit herds and relied heavily on social bonds for survival, this breakdown may have undermined the very fabric of their community. Without the ability to recognize kin or maintain social cohesion, the last mammoths would have grown more isolated, even from each other. Generation by generation, Wrangel Island was not a place of death, but a place of slow unraveling. The island did not destroy the mammoths. It preserved them, just long enough for their own shrinking genetic legacy to betray them. With no fresh DNA from outside populations, no migration, and no evolutionary reset, the flaws began to define them. Each new generation was a copy of a copy, carrying the errors of the past forward without correction. The tragedy of Wrangel Island was not one of sudden violence or climate catastrophe, but of biology stretched beyond its limits. The mammoths were not weak or inferior. They were simply stranded in an evolutionary trap with no escape. In the end, nature had no tools left to save them. Wrangel Island had become a quiet graveyard, not because it killed the mammoths, but because it kept them alive just long enough for their own genes to bring about their silent, inevitable end. Chapter 3. When the world changed and the mammoths didn't far from the isolated silence of Wrangel Island, the rest of the world was undergoing one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. The Ice Age had ended. Massive glaciers melted and retreated toward the poles, raising sea levels and redrawing coastlines. Ancient mammoth steppes, once vast open grasslands that stretched across continents, vanished beneath encroaching forests, expanding wetlands and the growing footprint of human civilization. Ecosystems shifted rapidly. Entire species had to adapt, migrate, or disappear. On the mainland, mammoths faced these changes head-on, competing with humans for land and resources in a world that was no longer theirs. But on Wrangel Island, time seemed frozen. Isolated by the sea, cut off from the changes sweeping the rest of the globe, the mammoths lived as though nothing had changed. Their world was a preserved fragment of an older Earth, a forgotten chapter still being written long after the rest of the book had moved on. But even this memory was starting to unravel. The island's climate, though buffered from extreme shifts, was not immune. Seasons grew less predictable. Vegetation became scarcer, and the grasslands that had once supported herds of mammoths began to thin. The traits that once made mammoths successful, large body size, heavy coats, and complex migratory knowledge, were becoming disadvantages in this new, shrinking environment. With no contact from the outside world, no way to sense that the Ice Age had passed, the Wrangel mammoths were stranded not just physically, but evolutionarily. They were still shaped by the conditions of a world that no longer existed. Meanwhile, their own biology was beginning to betray them. The genetic damage from centuries of inbreeding was taking a toll. Some mammoths could no longer absorb essential minerals properly. Others may have developed irregular or patchy fur due to faulty pigmentation genes. Their teeth, which were crucial for grinding the tough vegetation of their environment, began wearing down more quickly, perhaps from a declining diet or from subtle developmental problems caused by genetic mutations. Newborn calves were increasingly weak and less likely to survive. Mothers struggled more with each generation, trying to raise young in an environment that no longer supported them. Cultural knowledge, migratory routes, food sources, social behaviors, once passed from generation to generation, began to fade as fewer mammoths lived long enough to teach or learn. On the outside, the Wrangell mammoths may have looked like the same creatures that once thundered across Eurasia. But internally, they were breaking down. At the same time, humanity was rapidly advancing. In the distant world beyond Wrangell, cities were rising from riverbanks, civilizations were taking root, and ships were beginning to cross oceans. Humans had entered history, but the mammoths remained trapped in prehistory, following the same ancient instincts, walking the same worn paths, unaware they were the last of their kind. There was no warning, no final catastrophe, no fire, flood, or spear. Around 4,000 years ago, the last mammoth simply died. The island went silent. A lineage that had survived for millions of years through shifting climates, predators, and ice ended not with violence, but with stillness. The mammoths, once mighty giants of the Ice Age, did not roar in their final moments. They faded gently, quietly, into extinction, leaving only bones, whispers, and the haunting lesson that survival in a changing world demands more than strength. It demands the ability to change,